Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Let me begin with a karakia before I introduce our speaker. The meaning of this karakia is, for this gathering, seek knowledge for understanding, have purpose in all you do. Stand tall, be strong, let's show respect for each other. E te whānau hui, whaia te mātauranga kia marama. Kia whai take ngā mahi katoa. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Welcome to this webinar of the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, everyone. And before I introduce our speaker, Barry Coates, let me mention a few things. This webinar is being recorded, and if you don't want your image to appear on it, just switch off your video. It will eventually be posted on YouTube and be available for your subsequent use and showing. When it comes to question times, put your questions in the chat box, and Christina and I will alternate in reading out the questions for Barry to respond to. So now a bit about the seminar, the webinar. I was thinking about the topic, and I was thinking, if you had a dog that was chasing your neighbor's chooks, or if you had a cat that was killing native birds, you would feel responsible for the harm that was being done by that entity, and you would do something about it. But lots of people in all wealth deciles have money invested, and it's running all over the planet, much of it doing a lot of damage to the biosphere. And tonight's webinar, Barry Coates will show us how this happens and how we can take proper responsibility for it. I want to say a little bit about Barry so that you will know some of his background that he brings to what he has to offer us tonight. Barry Coates has a master's in management from Yale. He majored in finance and was a corporate strategy consultant in the US. His relevant experience includes leading the mainstreaming of fair trade in New Zealand, and fair trade revenues grew by an average of 45% per annum for a decade, which is pretty remarkable. He's managed social marketing campaigns for over 2 decades, and most recently was executive director of Oxfam from 2003 to 14. Subsequently, Barry developed a sustainability program at the University of Auckland Business School, and he served in Parliament as a Green List MP in 2016-17. Barry is a member of the Expert Technical Working Group of the Sustainable Finance Forum, a member of the Aotearoa Circle, and he's steering the development and implementation of Mindful Money. This is an entity that has the support of experts in the investment community and sustainability networks, and is very much the instrument by which we can take responsible care of our money running all through the biosphere. So over to Barry, and I'm delighted that you're here to help us think through how we should take responsibility. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Jonah. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, kia Barry Coates aho, ko te kārahi o Te Patea Whai Whakaro, which is the name for Mindful Money. No mai haere mai, whakatau mai ki tēnei hui mariko. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with a august Nelson audience, and Molly, when I was a young person learning about alternative energy, you were an inspiration and still have been for so long since. So it's great to be here, and um, I'm going to do a little presentation. Is a saying that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So I'll try not to get completely bound up in the presentation, and do feel free to kind of wave your hand if you want to stop me during it. Um, why don't I just crack on and share a screen? I'm not the most technologically literate, so we're going to have a break halfway through. I'm going to have to swap screens. But anyway, so be a climate smart investor. Let me see here. Where we should be able to. There we go. Um, so this is, why are we doing this now? Because the world is facing uh, ecological boundaries that we are breaching, which is the outer layer. I don't need to probably tell any of you about this diagrams from the Stockholm Environment Institute, Johan Rockström and others. I think it's a really good way for us to understand how we are breaching the biosphere, the biosphere limits. But on the inside is the human limits, is the limits in terms of breaching human rights. And as Joanna said, part of my background, as well as working in environmental issues, is working in poverty and social justice for Oxfam and other organisations. And the inner circle is from Kate Raworth, who some of you may know from Donut Economics. And Kate's work on, in a way, matching the ecological and the social, I think is really important. One of the things that Joanna didn't say is when I was younger, I was on the British government delegation to the US Summit. And some of you may remember the US Summit in 1992, the biggest world event ever. It's when sustainable development really was talked about and launched. But for me, that was a formative time. It was the time the Climate Change Convention was signed, the Biodiversity Convention was signed, and it was an opportunity for really taking action on sustainability that was never taken up by governments who lacked any vision or imagination. I remember George Bush Senior saying the American way of life is not up for negotiation, and that pretty much killed any chances of progress. So that's kind of the bigger picture. If we turn to finance, it's my favorite cartoon of all time. It's these people sitting around in a post-apocalyptic world, and this cave paintings of a modern skyscrapers on the walls, and they're huddled around a fire. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And this kind of sounds like it's a bit of a characterization of the finance industry, but I tell you, it is really true. This is the way that I have found that the finance industry works, that they have proceeded as if making money and making profits is the only consequence that they need to be concerned about. So many of the fund managers who manage the money don't ask where the money goes and what the consequences of those investments are. And it's quite hard to believe that people wouldn't do that. But that's the way that the finance system has traditionally worked. that actually it's been the risk, the return, or the financial metrics that have mattered. Where the money goes and what the impacts are have been irrelevant. And so that's one of the reasons that we have got ourselves into the current crises, social and environmental crises that we have, because money makes the world go around, and that's what money does. When I left Parliament, I kind of was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and this cartoon really spoke to me. And so what I did was to create Mindful Money to see if we could make a difference on these kind of issues. So when we're setting it up, we started off by doing some surveys, and this is a survey of the New Zealand public. The survey says that around 3/4 of New Zealand would like to have their money managed ethically. So if you've got a KiwiSaver account or you've got any other kind of financial investment, most people, 3/4 of people say, I want my money managed ethically. But we also asked the question, well, what are the barriers to being able to do that? And the top barriers were, I don't have time to look at all the options and compare them. There's not enough independent information available. And I don't believe the claims made by funds describing their offers as responsible, sustainable, or ethical. And I think for many people, those are real barriers. Those are some of the reasons why people don't take the step to say, okay, I'm going to vote with sustainability in mind or with ethics in mind. It's because of these kind of barriers. And in a way that helped us in developing Mindful Money, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to, in a way, get past these kind of barriers. So let me kind of move into how to make everything far too complex. There are different ways to invest your money ethically. So there's kind of a spectrum. On the left-hand side, in red, you've got the traditional way, which is completely ignoring ethics, and that's the traditional way that money is managed. You basically manage it for earning as much money as possible, and you're not aware of the consequences. The next stage is to avoid harm. And when you avoid harm, you say, I don't want to invest in fossil fuels. I don't want to invest in weapons. I don't want to invest in companies that practice cruelty to animals. So that's the most common way that people can understand how to invest ethically. And surprisingly, although most people want to avoid those kind of investments, actually, as you'll see later on, most of the fund managers ignore them. This next phase is what you do as a fund manager when you invest. So if you buy shares in a company, you basically have a voice on their governance. So this area of corporate governance means that you can engage with the company as a shareholder, in order to shift them. So if you're a very big fund manager, then what you can do is you can influence companies. And I'll show you one of the ways that they do that. What you can also then do as you move along to the yellow area is you can invest for higher standards, in good companies like All Good Organics or Kathmandu and companies like that. Or finally, which is really nirvana for many people, you can invest your money in ways that does good to society and good for the environment. And that's called impact investing. And that's really where a lot of people would like to be able to put their money. But in New Zealand, we have not seen many alternatives that enable members of the public to invest in that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these issues and explain a little bit more about it to basically tell you how you can invest in. So what do New Zealanders want to avoid in their investments? Well, 90% want to avoid companies that violate human rights. 85% want to avoid companies that practice cruelty against animals, like animal testing, or companies that use animals for entertainment. 75% want to avoid companies that produce fossil fuels, etc. And you can see the other ones. So what you'd imagine is that then the people who are managing your money would take a look at this data and they'd say, okay, I'm going to design my fund so I don't invest in those things. But that's not quite the case. What we did is we found a way to be able to look at all of the companies that every single KiwiSaver fund invests in. So there's around 350 KiwiSaver funds in New Zealand, and we now know which companies that all 350 of those KiwiSaver funds invest in. And what we then do is we take those company names and then we relate them to what business they're in. So there may be fossil fuel producers, there may be companies that practice cruelty, animal cruelty, they may violate human rights, etc. So what this pie chart does is it adds up all of the money in each of those categories. So if you're a KiwiSaver, then $3.191 billion of your money is going into companies that produce fossil fuels. And almost $2 billion is going into companies that practice cruelty on animals. And around 1.4 billion into companies that systematically violate human rights. So we add these figures come from adding up all of the 350 KiwiSaver funds and say how much New Zealanders' money from KiwiSaver are going into these things. So when you sort of look at the data of what people want to avoid, then what you then see is that many of the fund managers don't avoid the things that New Zealanders want to avoid. And it's often because they regard themselves as financial experts and they don't really want to listen to what people have to say. It is, I think, the least customer-driven and publicly driven industry that exists on the planet. So they typically think that they know best, and the public really doesn't have a voice in where their money goes. And as when I said that people invest in fossil fuel companies, it's not only they invest in fossil fuel companies, they end up investing in some of the worst fossil fuel companies in the world. So these companies here are some of the major companies invested in through KiwiSaver that are not only slow to transition into renewable energies, they're still expanding their fossil fuel production. So they're still investing most of their capital expenditure in looking for more oil and gas and developing more oil and gas. So, when you hear them talking about, oh yes, we've signed a pledge to net zero, or we're on a transition pathway, then for these companies, they are greenwashing. And they've been called out recently, not only by the UN Secretary General, but very strongly by a woman called Christiana Figueres, who used to run the climate change negotiations. And as she said, for a decade, I used to give these people some space to say, well, maybe they'll actually change despite, my concern about it. And she said, now I just don't believe them, and I think they're greenwashing. And increasingly, that's the verdict on those fossil fuel companies. So far, what we've been talking about are ways you can avoid stuff. And one of the things is you can go onto the Mindful Money website and you can have a look at your investments, and you can find a fund that avoids investing in these kind of companies. We have lists of funds, KiwiSaver funds, that don't invest in fossil fuels, for example. So those are ways that you as a consumer can take your choices to avoid the things you don't want. Some people don't really want to avoid stuff. They think that, well, we may as well use the power of investors to try and change companies instead of just avoiding the bad ones. And the case that's celebrated was a couple of years ago. The investors ganged up on ExxonMobil, and there was a campaign that was kicked off by a hedge fund with the very quaint name of Engine Number One. And they managed to convince many of the big fund managers, some of you may know names like BlackRock or Vanguard or State Street, they got them to vote out 3 Exxon directors and replace them with more climate-friendly directors. So that's when people talk about engagement or stewardship, that's a promise that you can actually change the companies. So you can make them into different companies through the power of the shareholders, and it's our money that they're using in order to vote for these changes to these companies. However, the reality is that these changes are very hard to achieve. So in Exxon's case, for example, they didn't actually change as a result of these 3 climate-friendly directors being appointed. They managed to appoint some more directors to kind of act as a counterweight for those 3 that had just come onto the board. And last year, Exxon's capital expenditure on renewable energy was, wait for it, 0%. And so companies like Exxon are not, as they say, making a transition from fossil fuels, they're doubling down on their core business. And so, when we said on the right-hand side is impact investing, this is kind of, we live in a world where money should be used for what we want money to be used for social housing, for renewable energy, for community development. There's a good story from one of the fund managers who invested in a Salvation Army social housing bond. So the Salvation Army wanted to build 118 social housing units in Auckland. So what they did, and it was backed by government funding for the people who were going into those social houses. So they basically packaged up the amount of money that they want, and they asked investors to invest in it, and they gave them a small return for their money. And so initially, one KiwiSaver manager, Generate, put some money into this, and then others did, Pathfinder, Simplicity, many of the other KiwiSaver managers as well. And increasingly what we're starting to see is the first signs that some of our KiwiSaver money is going into social housing, is going into renewable energy and community development, and things like that does make a positive difference. The problem is it's still just a few percent of our money, while a lot of the rest of our money goes on things that we don't want them to invest in. So, the goal is we need money for the global goals, the SDGs, and so that's where impact investment can potentially make a big difference. But we also, as well as funding the SDGs, there's a particular issue around climate change. This chart shows on the right-hand side in the dark blue, this is for the average New Zealander, where your carbon footprint is based on what you do. So most of it, almost 3 tons, is in your travel, driving cars, airplanes, etc. And this is the average New Zealander, so it's not somebody who has an EV and or walks or cycles everywhere. It's the average New Zealander. So that's about 2.8 tons. And then you've got food, shopping, electricity, and other things. So the total of all of that is 7.7 tons per person of CO2 emissions. If you look at your KiwiSaver, when you get an average KiwiSaver, it's investing your money in companies that generate about 2.3 tons of CO2. So actually the amount of your influence through your money is really large, even compared to your overall footprint. So that says that if you wanted to make a difference, you should, of course, kind of cut down on your travel carbon emissions, but you should also look at what's in your KiwiSaver fund and cut down on your KiwiSaver fund emissions. And there are ways to do that. So there are 3 ways to do it, and they're kind of like that chart that I showed on the left-hand side. Portfolio construction means you can avoid the high emissions companies. So that's kind of avoid the stuff that produces really high emissions. Secondly, in the middle is active ownership or engagement. You can persuade companies via the power of shareholding to reduce their emissions. Or over on the right-hand side, you can invest in renewable energy and other climate solutions. So those are ways that you as an investor can actually make a difference on climate change. So, the answer is kind of no business on a dead planet. We try and tell the finance managers that they live on this planet as well, and they should be taking action on climate change. Just as an aside, Mindful Money's initiated annual surveys of what the finance industry does on climate change to try and reduce these emissions. And the answer is that we do far less in Australia, which is a little bit galling, and a lot less than investment managers do in Europe. So we've got a long way to go in New Zealand. I'm just going to sort of finish this part of the presentation with one other thing. People think it's kind of investing ethically or investing responsibly or for climate action comes with a cost. And it's kind of like if you buy organic eggs, then you pay a lot more for them. But the funny thing is that most people don't believe that. If you look at this, most people think, or 45% of people say you actually earn more money by investing ethically in the long term than investing traditionally. And another 45% aren't sure or they're neutral on it. And there's a stack of evidence to say that actually that's correct, that if you invest ethically over the long term, then you can generally earn returns from your money that are as high or higher than if you were to invest in some of the bad stuff. And one of the reasons is this chart here. This is a chart that shows on the top line the kind of like the market average, and this is from data from the United States. The market average has really gone up about 10% per annum. But this dark blue line down below is the oil and gas companies. And these are the kind of the values of the companies in each of those parts of the market. So if you see the bottom line, they have lost over 5% per annum on their investments. The top line has made over 10% on their investments. So if you're an investor and your KiwiSaver fund invests in fossil fuels, then over the past 10 years, you would have lost about 15% compared to what you would have got if you had invested in the market average. So that's one of the reasons that investing ethically can produce good returns, because people have been waking up to the fact that climate change is going to produce a very bleak future for fossil fuel companies in the future. So this is this chart shows that already their share prices have started to decline. So that's all kind of by way of background. Let me just kind of turn to Mindful Money. This is a statue from Wall Street, actually, in New York. And I think it's a lovely image because it's this kind of young girl who's standing up to the rampaging bulls of Wall Street, the sort of rampaging investment world. And it's kind of like empowerment to say that as investors, we can actually take back control of our investment. And we don't have to just rely on somebody else to take all of our decisions. That actually, by understanding where our money goes and being able to direct it to funds that can align with our values, then actually we can make things a lot better in the world. This is our website. It's www.mindfulmoney.nz. Feel free to kind of tune into it on your mobile phone. This is where things get a bit tricky because I used to think that I can link to this, but I'm going to stop sharing just for a sec. So let me do that. I'm going to stop sharing and then start sharing again and see if I can. Oops, where's it gone? Oh, there we go. Can you all see this? This is the Mindful Money website, and I'll just show you a few things you can do on it. So you tab down, make your money, force for good, etc. You see this first one, check my funds. So you click on check my funds, and it says check and compare funds. We're going to put in a fund. Anyone got a favorite fund they want to check out? I'll put in the biggest one in New Zealand, which is called the ANZ Growth Fund. And so we just start writing that and it'll come up down below that. Here we go. It's actually the AMP ANZ one, but that's all right. So what you can see is here, this is what they invest in as the ANZ Growth Fund. You see on the yellow line, that's human rights violations. And they invest 1.8% in that. That's environmental harm come across. That's animal cruelty. That smaller one there is weapons, etc. But the really nice thing you can do is see the fund details up here. You click on that, and what it shows you is all the companies that they invest in. So here are the companies, for example, that have been cited for human rights violations: Nestle, Thermo Fisher, Rio Tinto, China Petroleum Chemical, etc. So these are the companies. If you want to find out more about the companies, just click on that link, and it'll show you a little bit of a thumbnail about why that company is on the list. And you go down here, so that's the human rights violations. On the left is environmental harm and cruelty, etc. And then you've got over on the right-hand side a very big long list on fossil fuels. It is Contact Energy. Contact Energy is one of the better ones. So we've got see that little 1.5 degrees C. That means that they are one of only 8 companies in the world that are actually on a 1.5 degree pathway to transition. So Contact Energy will be 95% renewable by the end of next year. If you see the kind of flames in here, these ones are the companies that are still expanding their exploration and production, like BHP, Woodside, down here Santos, and others. So you can check out all of the companies that they're invested in, and that's all from. Let me just go up to the top. Let me just get this. And if you want to, you can then add another fund. So we can add let's look one that's actually a little bit better. It's called a fund called Pathfinder. And we'll look at Pathfinder KiwiSaver Growth Fund. And so we can now compare these two. And so that's the ANZ Growth one at the top and the Pathfinder Growth Fund down the bottom. They've still got one or two things in it, but the fossil fuel companies that they have in there are only the ones on a 1.5 degree pathway. So not as bad as some of the other fossil fuel companies. So this way you can kind of compare between different funds, and you can add a whole lot more, so you can look at different funds. So Mindful Money did all this work, and then we did something which is really stupid for our business model. We're a charity, so we had made all this information available for free, and so anyone can go and have a look at it. And it's because what we want is we want people to see what they're invested in. We want them to kind of understand what their choices are with investments. Once you can check your fund, you may want to go over to this top right button, Find a Fund. And Find a Fund will enable you to find, in this case, a KiwiSaver fund. What you do is you answer some questions. Say, okay, well, I really want to avoid human rights violations. I really want to avoid animal cruelty, not so keen on weapons either. Maybe social harm isn't so, I'm not so worried about tobacco and alcohol. So you make these selections, then you choose your approach and you say, well, I really want to avoid those companies. So I'll put that top. And then maybe I don't care about investing in these companies that engage and try and influence other companies. I'll put that one to the bottom. So you can make your choices on that. And then you choose your risk profile. And your risk profile is typically how long you're going to invest and how risky do you want it to be. And the trade-off is if you are investing for a long time and you're prepared to take on a risk, then you get one of these growth and aggressive funds. And that typically means that you take on more risk, but it means that you can earn more money as well. You get typically higher returns. So we'll click on that one, and then we'll see our results. And these are kind of ethical funds that will most closely meet your criteria. And so Pathfinder, KiwiSaver Growth, and same thing through a different channel. This one's from Medical Assurance Society. This is from a fund provider called Booster, Mercer, Booster, etc. So that's the way that the Mindful Money website works. Got lots of information about, for example, educational guides, research and reports, opinions and blogs. Over on the right-hand side, we've got seminar series. So as I said earlier on, there's a seminar coming up tomorrow on renewable energy. And it's particularly looking at global trends on renewables, featuring somebody from Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, and also talking to a couple of people locally who are investing in renewables, and somebody who's campaigning on against fossil fuels. So we'll have a nice sparky seminar tomorrow at lunchtime. So we've got all the seminar series up there for you to join, and there's about 60 past seminars on that. So lots more on the website. Let me stop there because I've been talking for far too long, and let's kind of take a break from me talking and open it up for questions.
Hi, Barry. I'm Louise. Hey. Oh, not sure if you can see me.
Oh, hi, Louise. How you doing?
Hi, good. I was actually really curious uh, because we have our money in Kiwi Bank. We used to have it in BNZ. We have an old ANZ account, and I noticed in the funds there's none of those big banks are at the top. It's Pathfinder and Booster, and you don't see any ANZ or BNZ. And is that generally the rule? Is you find those big commercial banks are not very ethical?
Yeah, Louise is exactly right. They're kind of slow to pick up on these issues. Um,
Mm.
when you bank, the way most people get a KiwiSaver is they get a KiwiSaver from their bank. And you don't have to. You can choose a KiwiSaver from a whole huge range. As I said, 350 to choose from now. But most people still get it via their bank. So if they're banking customer of ANZ, they get an ANZ KiwiSaver account. It is absolutely free for you to shift your KiwiSaver. And it is amazingly quick. We have people who come onto Mindful Money and say, I shifted my KiwiSaver in 10 minutes. And, I've been waiting for 10 years to do that because I thought it was going to be really hard. But actually, it's easy. And if you don't like it, you can shift again. And so um, you shouldn't feel kind of disempowered that you can't shift away from your bank. If you've got a bank KiwiSaver or a bank investment fund, you can shift to somebody else if you like. The only drawback is you don't see it on your bank statement, which some people like, but that's a relatively uh, minor disadvantage. So yes, Louise, the banks tend to be behind on kind of investing ethically and sustainably.
Hey, Barry, maybe I'll come in with a question and then. So tell me, have you had any dialogue with the investment industry about all of this, and how do they react to it? Do you see any improvement over time? Are they receptive to these sorts of messages?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We've been going about 3 years, and we engage frequently and in a complex way with the finance sector. As you can see, there's people come on to the website and they see things that the people from the finance sector really don't want you to see. They don't want you to see all of the fossil fuel companies that they're invested in, or the fact that they invest in gambling or weapons production and so on. So there's a lot of them whose initial kind of reaction is not to like us very much. Others who kind of recognize they're on a journey and actually the world is going towards sustainability and stronger ethical standards, and they've got to do that too. So a lot of them are kind of somewhere on that journey. And so I would say for most of the finance sector, we have quite a reasonable dialogue with them. We have quite a good relationship with those who are doing good work and who are leading. And one of the things we do is we run annual awards. And the annual awards are for the most ethical KiwiSaver fund, the most ethical investment fund, the one that has the strongest positive impact. So we have those awards, the ones that are best for climate change, and then we also give awards to financial advisors and media reporting on these issues. So we're trying to do a kind of carrots and stick. So, at the same time, we published, for example, all of those KiwiSaver funds that were investing in companies aligned to Putin at the time that Russia invaded Ukraine. That's the stick. That's the kind of the stuff that they really don't like because we're using transparency to expose what they're doing with our money. But we're also doing the carrot. We're saying that for those who are really progressing and who are really doing good work, then we'll actually get in there and we'll engage with you and we'll celebrate you being one of the leaders. So all of that is changing the industry, not as fast as we would like, but there's been a huge change in the number of ethical funds and the way that the leading part of the funds management industry, generally not the banks, the leaders are really starting to have really much better practices. We're not there yet, Chris, but after 3 years, we've and our power is also by talking to consumers. So we've had more than 300,000 people visit our website to do research, to do what you've just seen and seeing where their funds are and so on. So once we get up to those kind of numbers, then in a way these finance companies have to sit up and pay notice, because we're talking to their customers and they recognize that they need to be doing stuff to change what they're doing.
Thanks, Barry. That's quite positive, I think. Yeah. Over 3 years.
It's very gratifying and very impressive that you've seen such changes. Are there counterparts to what you're doing in New Zealand in other parts of the world, Barry?
Oh, Joanna, that's an interesting question. No, and there is nobody who does exactly what we do anywhere that we're found in the world. And one of the reasons is that we have a stronger regulatory system in New Zealand, where these funds every 6 months have to report the direct investments that they do, so the companies they directly invest in. But they also, most of them, invest in other funds. And so when you look at what they declare, it's in a register of the company's office that is really impossible to find and work with. So we take that information, we then explode out the funds that they invest in. So you see the companies inside those funds, and then the companies that are inside the funds within the funds within the funds, kind of like a Russian doll. And we use that investigation to be able to then say, here's all of the companies that they invest in. And there isn't anyone who does quite that same thing internationally. There's a great organization in the United States called As You Sow, which is similar, but they don't do all the portfolio analysis. And there's a number of activist organizations that do kind of actions around company annual general meetings. They try and influence companies through corporate governance. So there's a group called Share Action in the United States. There's a group called Market Forces in Australia, and so on. So there are some people who do similar things, but not quite like for money.
Gosh, one would hope that it'd be emulated elsewhere, because it's really very impressive. And Sharon Brinston has a message saying, thank you so much for doing this and making it available. It's extremely valuable.
Thank you. Did I see, Anne, you had your hand up?
Hello, Barry. Yes, I did have my hand up, but Joanna has asked my question.
Sorry.
I wanted you to talk more. Yeah, I wanted to know more about the unique regulatory framework in New Zealand, and what developments there have been internationally. But you've basically covered all that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's when we started it off, and we being a startup charity, we of course had no money, and so in the early days, it was me and a group of volunteers who put the information together first. Now we've got me and 4 part-time staff members, and we still have a big team of volunteers who help out, and so it's kind of a lot in a way a lot easier than it was when we started out. But it's still a huge amount of work to do all that analysis. So 350 KiwiSaver funds, 450 other investment funds, and each of those funds have got up to 5,000 companies in them. So it's just an enormous amount of data to put on the website, plus all the seminars and the awards and the other things. So we're pretty busy, but it's been great.
Matthias.
Yeah, hi, Barry. Thanks for an informative talk, and I learned a few things. I'm interested about the chart you showed with the S&P ratings of the general funds and parallel the oil and gas ones. If that's sort of common, I guess, industry knowledge, why does any fund manager include oil and gas then?
What a brilliant question. I don't know the answer to that, Matthias. And this is kind of knowledge that any fund manager could just look up themselves really easily. But they're kind of constrained by their mental models. And their mental models is that if you spread your money widely over a whole lot of different companies, you diversify your portfolio, you diversify the money, and that lowers the risk overall of your investment. So, that's true, but it assumes kind of like efficient markets and, it assumes things like climate change don't exist, and so they aren't thinking about, I don't know if you remember Lord Nicholas Stern, who said climate change is the biggest market failure the world has ever seen. And so that's not the way fund managers think. They don't think in terms of climate change being a market failure. So they expect the market to work in the way so that you don't see such a big gap between a particular type of company like fossil fuels from the average. And so even now, what we've seen over the last couple of years, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the oil price went up. And so what happened? Those fund managers ignored the past 10 years and they piled a whole lot more of KiwiSaver money into those fossil fuel companies. Even though, as we're going to hear from the seminar tomorrow, we are very close to peak oil, and what the RMI people, the Rocky Mountain Institute people say is that by 2030, fossil fuels will be on a very rapid downhill slide in terms of public demand. So I hope you're right. It's a good question, Matthias. I don't understand why they don't know more about their own business and how to invest sensibly.
Thank you.
Sharon, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. I can appreciate how much work goes into this and how effective some kind of obfuscation could be. Is there obfuscation kind of, or, ways that they can stop this level of transparency easily, or is our regulation up to the task?
Yeah, this is happening around the world, actually, Sharon, that you've now had cases against greenwashing and misleading claims. People saying they're net zero when they're not, or people saying that they are tobacco free when they're not. You've had those cases in the United States, in Germany, in Australia quite recently. One of the biggest funds called Vanguard was just taken to court by the Australian financial regulator. And in New Zealand, the financial regulator, the FMA, has been threatening to take New Zealand funds to court and fine them for not telling the truth about ethical standards. So, one of the things that's different in New Zealand, though, is people can go into Mindful Money and look at it and see exactly what these funds invest in. So they have to be a little bit more careful with their claims because they can be found out now. And so I think possibly one of the things that is happening here is that there's been a real toning down of these funds claiming to be sustainable or claiming to be good for the world or good for the planet, because they know they're going to be called on it. And basically, I think soon the FMA will probably do a case on somebody. They're kind of waiting to make an example of one of these fund managers making a false claim. I actually I think a better way for them would be to actually make them disclose more information. I think that would really help people, because you can see a whole lot of stuff on Mindful Money, but they should be disclosing a whole lot more stuff themselves. And they don't. They disclose a lot of stuff about who their directors are and how much money they made for the last 10 years and what their fees are and so on. But they don't have to disclose virtually anything on their ethical issues or sustainability issues until the climate change legislation came along. So this was a thing that James Shaw pushed, which was called the climate disclosure legislation. And now for the first time, they're going to have to declare the emissions, not only from New Zealand's biggest companies, but also from these big fund managers. So they're going to have to do, like that chart that I showed, to say how much emissions is in your footprint. They're going to have to do the same thing with their funds. They're going to have to say that ANZ Growth Fund that's invested in all these fossil fuel companies, cement companies, airlines, everything else, they're actually going to have to say what their emissions are in those funds. And that will really help because that kind of disclosure then enables people to have a better source of information to do that. And of course, we'll pick up that information and show it on Mindful Money as well.
That's great. It's very encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
and the other thing, just talking about regulation, the one thing government did do is you know what default funds are? So default funds are where your KiwiSaver money is put if you don't nominate a fund. So the government, there was a concerted push to encourage them to rule out fossil fuel investing for the default funds. So when you kind of look through the figures, the default funds have got much lower fossil fuel holdings than any other funds or most other funds. And that's because there's now been a regulation put in place to require that. It's not zero fossil fuels because they managed to lobby their way out of that, but it's certainly much lower than it would otherwise have been. So we need government regulation, we need government standards on this, and we need people like the Financial Markets Authority to slap people on the wrist and fine them when they make misleading claims.
Thank you. Last
and people like
question
Mindful
goes.
Money. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question goes to Molly Mellish. Go ahead, Molly.
Do you have any way, Barry, to distinguish between 100% renewable electricity, which is what the government advertises it's promoting, and recognize the degree to which 100% renewable electricity is driving outrageous types of investment, of which the very worst, in my opinion, is the offshore wind farm now being promoted for Taranaki. There are the way the electricity industry in New Zealand has driven corporate growth goals in a way that worsen as bad as Muldoon is at his worst. Do you have any way of assessing that type of inflation, which is not, because when you think of all the concrete and steel, fiberglass, and rare earths that go into those wind turbines, they are driving us very quickly towards collapse. Any way of recognizing and documenting that?
No, not really, Molly. We are going to talk about some of those issues tomorrow in the seminar, and but you know, I think there's a systemic problem there with the gentailers, the big four generators and retailers. They get away with a really uncompetitive market, and they are kind of shutting out the smaller independent electricity retailers. They're shutting out other people who would do renewable energy, some of which is much lower impact. And I think there's a real need to properly regulate the energy generation and electricity sector, because at the moment they use this kind of marginal cost pricing that basically prices at the cost of Huntley coal. And so it enables these gentailers to make absolutely massive profit. I added up, last year they made $1.5 billion, and that was $880 per household in New Zealand, per customer in New Zealand. $880, and that's just a profit that they made. It's absolutely outrageous, because they got given the hydro assets. That was kind of not their cost, and they have completely failed to invest over the past 3 decades in renewable energy. I think it's just absolute shocker.
Yeah, and that change was when they fired the electricity commissioner, Roy Hemingway, and made the electricity authority, which is governed by the corporates for their profit and expansion. Now, I would not want to put any of my money into an electricity corporate. I would much rather I would do anything to invest in community energy in competition with the corporates to try to push the corporates down. Can your group do that like that?
Well, we're not directly working on that. I've been for years a board member of 350 Aotearoa. Most of you probably know them, but they're doing a really good community-based renewable energy program, and I kind of commend their work. It's really interesting. So I think there are some things like that happening, Molly, that are really interesting. There are kind of local renewable energy supply schemes, neighborhood schemes, district schemes where people are pooling together and being able to basically have pooled electricity. I think the future of the electricity system is probably going to be far more decentralized than it is now, and hopefully a lot less run by the big corporates. So I think there's a better alternative out there.
We
There
will have to close now. We're a bit over time.
Joe, if I could just interrupt you, Joe, I know we're over time, but I noticed David had his hand up for ages wanting to ask a question and didn't get a chance. So I'd really like to hear if everybody would be willing to hang in for a little bit longer. I'd like to hear David's question.
No problem.
Sorry to David. You're still there, David. Do you want to go ahead with your question?
David, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, you need to unmute
We've
yourself.
heard about all. I've done that now. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah.
beyond oil and gas, which Barry's used as an illustration, Barry, you've also mentioned the new legislation, which is coming into force. These things always have a long pipeline. And I've been doing some work on this for the government, the External Reporting Board legislation on climate-related disclosures framework. So essentially, this is going to introduce a whole new language and vocabulary to us. So we need, as you've suggested, do our homework on current funds, but this is a great new opportunity to look more broadly. Impacts in other sectors, obviously our agricultural industry is a known example, but do you agree that this is going to open out a lot of interesting areas of inquiry for people like you and people like us as consumers?
Yes, I do. And I think that's the power of good information, David, and more power to the XRB, the External Reporting Board that you've been working with in producing this information. I do have a concern that for the first few years, because the people reporting their climate emissions are going to be reporting using some different methodologies, some different scenarios, etc. It's going to be really hard to compare across different companies and across different funds. But I think that'll iron itself out over a few years, and I think it's a big step forward. I'd also like to see similar reporting for example, for companies that are polluting the environment, for other forms of environmental damage, for social damage, and human rights violations, etc. It would be good to have that climate reporting expanded out to other social and environmental issues as well.
Thanks,
Otago
Thanks.
University's permission to do a major study. Look out for it.
Okay,
Great,
thank you.
great.
And there are also thanks on the chat from a number of other people. Let me, before I thank Barry, let me just point out that you can sign up to our newsletter to know what next events are coming from the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum. The very next event is on screen tonight. Adrian Cochrane is talking about how much energy is involved in using your computer in 2 weeks' time. But now let me turn to thank Barry very much for for your generosity, not just your generosity tonight, Barry, in speaking to us, but also the spirit of generosity in which you began Mindful Money and continue to run Mindful Money. I have known of it for a while, but I must admit I hadn't realized what a precious and unique resource it is, that we would all do well to turn to. So on behalf of all of us, I thank you very much for tonight and for your years of knowledge and work that have gone into creating this resource for us. Let me
Thanks very much, Joanna.
You're most welcome. Let me end with a karakia, which the imagery is we've been rowing our waka together over the sea and we've come to shore and we're getting out of our waka and ending the evening. Ko te hā, ko te rā, ko Tangaroa, ko te mana, ko te kotahitanga o ngā mātā waka. Aumie, uie, taike. Thank you.